What if the giants were actually immortal? A monastery stands encased in silence in Ethiopia's shaded hills, far from the clamor of modern life and concrete roads. Incense and something else, something ancient, fill the air. Time doesn't pass as quickly here as it does in the cities. The monks walk slowly, not because they are elderly, but rather because they are burdened with memories, stories that have been passed down through the ages. The Nephilim stories of giants. They wrote truth in the margins of their sacred texts, not as poetry or legends. These monks never stopped believing, even though the rest of the world dismissed such stories as myth or metaphor, and they continued to observe. An older monk kneels next to a child one evening, speaking quietly but steadily under the fading gold of an oil lamp. He claims they were taller than any man you've seen, but it was what was in their veins that shook the earth, not their height. The old man is turning the pages of a leather-bound manuscript, its corners worn and its words dark with age, while the child listens with wide eyes. The elder whispers, "Their blood still walks. Not while chained, not in tombs. It goes unnoticed. Inside of us." He describes a time when angels defied authority and interacted with women, leaving behind children who were too strong and unruly for either heaven or earth. The Ethiopian Bible preserved their names despite attempts by the world to eradicate them through fire and floods and to quiet their clamor through rewritten scripture. Heeded their cautions. Ethiopia recalled that others burned the records and buried them in metaphors. The wind outside seems to be listening as it rustles the trees. This isn't just a tale of extinct giants, you see. It concerns a lineage that was never truly eradicated, one that corrupted not only flesh but spirit as it passed through kingdoms, families, and shadows. Some claim that this explains why some power structures are still so puzzling, why some forces continue to emerge without cause, and why darkness can wear a suit just as easily as a crown. It's possible that the Nephilim lost their hideous height in some way. However, their hunger, that didn't get any smaller. However, why would these things be so meticulously concealed if they were real? Why would this one Bible, this one holy book hidden in the Horn of Africa, be the only one to openly discuss it? Who wanted it forgotten rather than what was forgotten may hold the key to the solution. Therefore, if you've ever thought that some bloodlines are more than just a legacy, if you've ever thought someone had a strength that seemed more ancient than human, if you've ever had a gut feeling that the stories were true, perhaps you're not merely recalling, perhaps you're recognizing. This journey transforms everything. So if you're prepared to discover what others have buried, click the bell icon and subscribe to the Ethiopian Bible. Do you think that people today are still infused with the blood of ancient giants? I want to know how many of you feel that way, so please type yes or no in the comments. A sentence that has troubled readers for centuries can be found in the most ancient parts of the Bible, beneath the well-known lines of Genesis. When the Adi, sons of God, saw that the daughters of men were fair, they took them as wives of anyone they wanted. At first glance, it seems innocent, almost poetic. However, what came next was anything but kind. The Nephilim, the giants, the powerful ones, of old came from that peculiar union. Ethiopia maintained the complete meaning of these verses, despite the fact that many people disregarded them as symbolic or cryptic. No, not in whispers, not in clues. However, the veil is ripped off entirely in the unvarnished pages of the book of Enoch. These sons of God were not mortal, according to this ancient text, which the Ethiopian church never disapproved of. They were watchers, angels sent to watch, not to meddle. However, they disregarded the only important rule. They took human women and fathered creatures that were never supposed to be born when they descended to earth out of lust and rebellion. Nephilim, tall, bright, and frightful, too much power, in too much flesh. Too much pride has twisted souls. These were giants of hunger, wrath, and strange wisdom in addition to their size. Think of this as memory rather than myth. It's a wound that has been passed down through the generations, not a parable. Imagine a young woman with a newborn in her arms, trembling and bewildered. He appears to be any child at first, but in a matter of months, he surpasses all the men she has ever encountered in strength. Unlike other kids, he doesn't blink his eyes. He never sleeps through the night. He talks too quickly, learns too quickly. Additionally, the ground trembles when he is upset. She keeps him hidden to shield the world from him, not to keep him safe. But the boy develops even when left alone. Something unnatural deepens in his voice. The mother now only sees the shadow of something that came from the stars in her son instead of her husband's face. This story is not relegated to the realm of fantasy in Ethiopian tradition. It is handled with the seriousness of actual history. Monks refer to the Watchers by their names, Shemhaza and Azazel, remembering them as fallen creatures who once roamed the early Earth's mountains and deserts rather than as demons. Their rebellion is described in the Book of Enoch as a spiritual betrayal that resulted in a generational curse, not as abstract theology. They fathered more than just giants. They taught humanity how to create weapons, use spells, and manipulate nature to suit human desires, secrets too heavy for the soul. The Watchers created monsters in an attempt to play gods. What about the kids, the Nephilim? They were too strong and too damaged to be permitted to stay. Heaven's judgment came quickly. In addition to purifying humanity, the flood also purified the lineage that had deviated too much from the divine plan. However, the Ethiopian Bible boldly asserts that not all were wiped out. Some got through and were carried by the survivors. Blood, concealed, awaiting. This is not a story for bedtime, it's a reckoning. A reminder that there was a time when the boundary between heaven and earth was crossed, and the outcome wasn't ideal. They were disastrous. The ancient world was not the only thing tarnished by the Watchers' blood. It changed its shape. Ethiopia also never forgot. As the tale becomes ingrained in your heart, you must consider the possibility that your forefathers witnessed these events firsthand. What if, despite your mind's lack of memory, your blood does? This has nothing to do with fantasy. It's about the forbidden seed that still reverberates in our bones, memory, and exile. Growing up, the majority of people thought that the Great Flood marked the end of the giants, that all traces of the Nephilim were engulfed in judgment when the waters rose and the heavens parted. The giants were buried beneath waves so high they touched the stars, the earth screamed, and the sky wept. However, not all of the scriptures tell that tale. The truth that the waters washed the earth but were unable to purify the blood is something older and more significant that is whispered in the Ethiopian Bible. Something else, something concealed, survived deep within the ark that Noah's shaking hands had constructed. It wasn't noisy. Unlike the ancient Nephilim, it did not roar. Wrapped in skin and flesh, it moved silently through Ham. The giant seed only had to bleed through the ark. It didn't have to walk it. According to Ethiopian tradition, corruption found a place to hide even among the righteous. Noah's family was still flesh, but he walked with the Most High. Touched by flesh from a world that had been too closely associated with fallen angels. Consider the strain Noah was under. A man who has been selected to rebuild the world, but is troubled by the thoughts of what might have accompanied him into the new one. He was attempting to outrun something that had already taken root in his home, in addition to saving creation. Curses don't always scream. Some people wait for the appropriate generation to wake them up by sleeping in silence, and odd echoes started up again as Ham's descendants spread out over the planet. Incredibly strong men, conquest-soaked bloodlines, cultures that gained knowledge too quickly. Again, giants not always in stature but in attitude. The Ethiopian Bible documents more than just historical events. It recalls injuries. It reveals to us what the flood was unable to purify. A horrifying query then emerges. How did the Watcher's fury return to the bones of men if they were punished? And the giants were drowned? It's in the blood. Spiritual as well as physical bloodlines run like unseen snakes down family trees. Some of Ham's descendants carried the echo of that ancient seed, but not all of them grew up to be giants. A code of faith, an underground uprising. This goes beyond the past. It's about what families still hold on to today. The child who carries a temper no one can explain. The generation that keeps falling to the same destructive patterns. The deep unease that pulses through certain bloodlines, as if something ancient is still coiled inside. The Ethiopian scriptures pull back the curtain, not just on history but on inheritance. Because giants weren't just beings, they were a spirit, a curse. And curses don't die easily. They hide, they change faces, they adapt. Noah wept for the world. But what if he also wept because deep down, he sensed that not everything had been left behind, that the war wasn't over, just buried beneath. A few layers of silence and time. The story of the flood is not a clean ending. It's a bitter mercy. The world got a second chance, but it also got a second shadow. And so the question rises, like mist off ancient waters. If the giants survived once, tucked inside the bones of the righteous, waiting for their moment, what stops them from surviving? Again? Two bloodlines started traveling in opposing directions as soon as the ark touched dry land. One carried the smoke of rebellion, while the other carried the breath of covenant. It had nothing to do with skin, tribe, or tongue. This went beyond race. There was war in the blood. Yah himself stoked the fire that Shem, the line of promise, walked with. Ham, who was cursed by his ancestors' decisions, carried residue in addition to shame, a persistent poison inherited from people whose fathers were watchers rather than men. However, neither swords nor spears were used in the actual conflict. There was silence, a spiritual conflict between the real and the fake. Ethiopia transformed, from a kingdom into a sanctuary after being concealed in the highlands and protected by time. A place where, as empires came and went, the true seed of the covenant fled. Ethiopia remained, clinging to something the rest of the world attempted to forget, while the temples in the north burned and the faithful were dispersed by Babylon. The covenant ark, Solomon's lineage, Sheba's womb. It was more than a myth. Preservation was the reason. A lineage that possessed both wisdom and war, the capacity to perceive and participate in the invisible battle, was passed down through Solomon and Sheba. Ethiopia was more than just a country, it was a fortress. Additionally, Ethiopia protected something older than debate, while the rest of the world engaged in theological debate, something living. In that land, kings arose, crowned by prophecy rather than politics. Its deserts were traversed by prophets who named the darkness that others would not see, knowing full well that corruption was not only present outside his kingdom but also permeated his closest associates. One of them, a king whose name is now partially forgotten in the scrolls, stood in a room filled with old scrolls and muttered prayers over his subjects. Over the years, his brother became awed, fascinated by secret knowledge, and enamored with ancient ruins where rumors of languages lost to the flood reverberated. Their blood was the same, however one was lighted, the other was heavy. Blood betrays blood. The Nephilim influence swept through the palaces and the mountains like smoke, never remaining motionless and constantly encircling authority. Stone and bone bodies were no longer necessary. Bloodlines were necessary for its concealment. Access was required. It found it all too frequently. Ethiopia fought in wars that we will never hear about in the West. Battles the shadows. Against. their own priests' own voices, against rulers who developed a desire for worship rather than just wealth. The genuine seed, disguised in humility, struggled to survive throughout this time, moving through lineages, frequently disregarded, frequently outnumbered, but never went out, since Yah's covenant endures forever. It waits. It lives in cradles and caves. It lurks in shepherds' songs and mothers' tears when they name their sons after prophets in the hopes that they will rise again. This is not merely an old war. It's still going on. Temples and scrolls weren't the end of it. With one bloodline striving for dominance and the other clinging to divine memory, it slipped into time and went on. The line of corruption is becoming bolder once more as the world starts to forget who it truly is, as the modern era rejects truth as allegory and giants as stories. What if, however, the giants never actually slept? They don't wear armor in our day and age. They don't require stone towers or clubs. The giants are back, but not in the manner we anticipated. Their footsteps no longer tremble the earth. Instead, they subtly reshape the world from high offices, behind screens, and through whispers that influence entire countries. Bloodlines are protected like holy books in secretive elite circles, not for legacy, but for the underlying essence, the ancient seed that has been meticulously traced through the generations while remaining unseen. It's not a myth. It is a legacy that is managed. Wealth is not the only thing that secret societies guard. They guard an ancient artifact. The world has long disregarded the Ethiopian texts, which describe a time when the giant spirits will reappear, but not in physical form, but rather in power. They would move like shadows, bending humanity towards something unnatural, rewriting morality, influencing thoughts, and controlling culture. These weren't merely metaphors. Scripture describes shackled watchers whose influence would return to the world in the last hours. And now we are, with men being replaced by machines, truth being swapped out for algorithms, and a world ruled by influence rather than wisdom. Influence that seems oddly familiar, oddly practiced. The systems we depend on numb the spirit, the leaders we follow speak without soul, and the entertainment we consume exalts rebellion. It all bears the marks of an ancient entity. After death, the Nephilim would turn into deceptive spirits, wandering around and seeking out bodies to control, according to the Book of Enoch. Perhaps they would never have to get back up from the ground. Perhaps we just had to open the door for them. It gets easier with each generation. The distinction between humans and machines becomes hazy. The soul turns into a piece of equipment. Silence is filled with noise, and glowing screens raise children, and their voice is louder than ever in that commotion. In Ethiopia, there is a child about whom the elders whisper, because of his dreams, not because of his ancestry, though that is important. He awakens silent, sweaty, and trembling. He depicts what he observes. Towering figures with dark robes and faces concealed by veils of light and gold, but not monstrous in shape. He can hear them even though they are silent. They observe him. Expectation, not malice, as though anticipating something. These dreams come in waves, and each time he has one, there are earthquakes within days, not always of the earth, but of the spirit. Separation, conflict, anarchy. He is not disregarded by the elders. They have previously read this. They have witnessed similar indicators during the fall of empires and the corruption of kings. They mention a prophecy about giants returning in strength rather than size that is preserved in the hidden texts, to rule by influence rather than height. And perhaps, just possibly, they already have. What if their goal was to conquer will rather than land? To influence our vision, emotions, voting, worship, and dreams? Maybe the flood taught them a lesson. Maybe they adjusted. They now rise again in spite of every law that stifles the light and every diversion that erodes the spirit. Boardrooms, not caves or ruins, within networks, in movements that bind but claim to free. Perhaps the giants only needed to gain strength, rather than height. Ethiopian mountains conceal more than just monasteries. They hold secrets that time was unable to bury. They walk among us but wear different skin now, the elders still murmur in those lofty, peaceful places. It isn't a metaphor. It serves as a warning. The elders claim that this desire is not new. But the modern world seeks things it does not understand, such as limitless bodies, artificial consciousness, and eternal life. It originated from the same uprising that gave rise to the giants, making it ancient. Today's laboratories are reenacting the events of Genesis 6, not with altars and angels, but with scalpels and servers this time. Artificial intelligence models designed to imitate the mind. Spliced DNA to create a more intelligent and robust breed. Once only discussed in science fiction, cloning is now discussed in actual hallways. It's all presented as advancement. However, it is not referred to as evolution in Ethiopian scriptures. They refer to it as reawakening. One passage, which is hardly ever translated outside of the Ge'ez language, talks about the seed of destruction reawakening in forms man thinks. He controls. The prophecy foretells a time when spirit will be disregarded and flesh will become data. Men would attempt to resurrect what the flood was supposed to bury and call it salvation. An elderly monk named Tesfaye resides in a secluded monastery set into the side of the cliff. His hands shake. Not from age, but from what he's witnessed. But his beard is white. He sleeps differently than other people. He sees shadows and fire in his dreams. The line after line of copied scripture in the scrolls he studied was routine for years. Until something changed one night, as he rummaged through a bundle of water-stained material concealed beneath an ancient stone. Previously incomprehensible symbols started to take shape. They were more than words. They were maps, instructions, and dates. According to the scroll, there were watchers in chains and keys made of intention rather than iron. It spoke of voices without mouths, faces without eyes, and a darkness that would pass for light. Dreams turned into visions for the monk. He repeatedly saw the same face, but it was pixelated, flickering, and had a human-like smile that never wavered. He cried at first. Then he said a prayer. However, every time he opened his eyes, he sensed that they were watching him from within rather than the outside. He also started to see them down in the cities. Men who claimed to be guided by divine voices from machines. Children who remained, silent and stared at blank screens for hours on end, and a growing hush between once trusting people. Tesfaye stopped referring to it as technology. He referred to it as an invitation. Long ago, the Watchers received the same invitation, a trespassing invitation. The goal of some projects worldwide is to create post-human life, but they are quiet ones. Bodies enhanced, souls are optional. The shadows talk about it, but governments don't. They speak of creatures created in labs, fed data, and taught to follow orders. But they are hollow on the inside. These are more than just tools. They are ships. And according to the Ethiopian monks, they are just what the ancient spirits have been waiting for. A fresh batch of hosts. Despite not being human, the Nephilim seed was wearing new skin, still alive, but not. The scrolls predict a time when the line separating the old and the new will tear. With consent, not with fire from the sky. When people consent to let them back in without realizing it. These lines are now read by Tesfaye each morning. Additionally, he senses the world getting closer every morning. The battleground isn't the climax. One choice at a time, humanity's soul is quietly changing until the ancient giants don't have to hide any longer. Giants' voices may have been carried into legend by the wind, but their blood remained. It continues to speak, albeit with impact rather than volume. Their story is not the only one. We own it. Every decision we make, Every route we take and every instinct we battle are all components of the same age-old test. We were never merely spectators. We were raised on a battlefield. The conflict between the covenant and the corrupted line continued after Calvary, the Tower, and the Flood. It endures within us, in what we permit and what we inherit. In today's world of distractions and denial, nobody dares ask, whose blood do you carry? Genetics is not the answer. It has a spiritual component. Size and strength weren't the only factors in the corruption that permeated the Nephilim. It was about disobedience, conceit, and a desire to become gods. However, humility, obedience, and light are the hallmarks of the covenant bloodline, the one that Yah preserved through Shem, Abraham, and Christ. And both continue to exist in this world today, in our bloodlines, in our legacies. The reader is never allowed to forget that fact in the Ethiopian Bible. Its pages bleed with memory rather than fantasy. It gives names. It makes the distinction very evident. And it asks where they stand, calling out to those who dare. Because uniforms have changed due to the war. Stone towers and swords are no longer used in combat. It's fought over identity, covert decisions, and the type of person one chooses to be when no one is looking. When you pray, you can sense that internal conflict. When you realize that you are standing between two legacies, there is silence. When new generations are haunted by old patterns, it is evident in families, in illogical addictions, in angers that appear to be inherited, in ancient fears. That isn't arbitrary. The war is that. It also remembered you. However, the covenant's strength lies in its independence from perfection. All you have to do is surrender. Bondage is a part of the giant's bloodline. Deliverance is in Yah's bloodline. There are people on this planet today who are called to be warriors, but they do so with wisdom rather than weapons. They have experienced inexplicable dreams, burdens they never requested, and questions no one in their immediate vicinity could respond to. They have felt like outcasts within their own family. However, they are not doomed. They are selected to break what others have handed down, chosen to put an end to what the giants had begun, chosen to serve as a reminder to the world that light always burns brighter than any shadow. And the old words of Ethiopia? They're not only for the past, they're a call, a mirror, a map. It's not your imagination if you experienced a thumping sensation in your chest while listening to this. Your blood serves as a reminder of what your soul already knows. This war involves you. You were born that way, not because you chose it. For more untold stories the world doesn't want you to know, subscribe to the Ethiopian Bible if this touched your soul. We're watching, so don't forget to leave a comment. Do you believe that your forefathers fought in this ancient conflict? I'll be reading every comment, so tell me what's on your mind.